Hi, this is Bill, and this is Progpaganda. As I suspect is true for most of you who watch this YouTube channel, I have seen a lot of rock and roll concerts over the course of my lifetime. I've enjoyed the vast majority of those shows, but some of them definitely stand out. Some were very well staged, with the visuals from the shows imprinting themselves on my brain. Others were very well performed, and some were important in that they happened at crucial times in the artist's development. The show I'm going to talk about today is one that checks all three of those boxes. It's a show that was delivered by Peter Gabriel in support of his third album on July the 7th, 1980, in Central Park in New York City. The show was delivered as part of a summer-long program called the Dr. Pepper Music Festival. The Dr. Pepper Festival, previously known as the Schaefer Music Festival, it had been originally sponsored by the Schaefer Brewing Company, was a great ticket during the months of July and August in New York throughout the 70s and into the early 1980s. It was an inexpensive ticket through which you could typically see 2, sometimes 3 bands on the bill and have a great time out on a summer evening. For the artists, it was a great ticket to land as far as pursuing the development of your audience. The larger venues in New York, like, for example, Madison Square Garden, would take the superstar acts and deliver shows for them. But venues like the Dr. Pepper Festival in Central Park were terrific for either second-tier or up-and-coming acts to get up close and personal with their audiences. The park only accommodated a few thousand people, and so the shows were very enjoyable. The sound was great, and there really wasn't a bad seat in the house. By 1980, Peter Gabriel had reached a turning point in his career. Peter Gabriel had, of course, started his solo career in late 1975 after leaving Genesis following the completion of their tour in support of their album, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Peter would, for the first several months after departing Genesis, basically hunkered down at home planning his next moves and getting reacquainted with his family, who he missed tremendously while out on the road with Genesis for the long periods of time that they would often tour. Genesis, of course, soldiered on with Phil Collins now taking vocals. And interestingly, in early 1976, with Genesis's first release with Phil Collins performing vocals, A Trick of the Tail, achieved their first really big success in the United States. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway had performed well. It had reached number 41 on the American charts. By comparison, however, A Trick of the Tail reached number 31 and was Genesis's first gold album in the United States. This is probably something that perhaps didn't upset Peter Gabriel, but certainly he took note of it and wanted to make sure that he could deliver product that was equally successful when it came time for him to put his first album out. Peter began work on his first album in late 1976 with Bob Ezrin producing. At least at the outset, Ezrin's choice as producer for Peter Gabriel probably seemed inspired, given Peter Gabriel's theatrical bent. Bob Ezrin had, of course, worked as producer in support of almost all of Alice Cooper's early material, and in 1976 had also produced the breakthrough studio album for Kiss, Destroyer. So he was definitely well known to the American public and on a roll. And the American public here really is crucial. Genesis and Peter Gabriel were well known in the UK. That wasn't really the case in the United States, at least not until The Lamb and A Trick of the Tail came out. Genesis's early albums weren't very well supported by the record companies they worked with. It really wasn't until 1973 when their record company, the famous Charisma label, changed distribution to Atlantic Records, where they started getting the promotion they really deserved. But in any event, with a top-flight producer from North America helming the project, it was thought that Peter Gabriel was well-positioned for his initial success. Peter would make his album in parallel with Genesis making their follow-up to A Trick of the Tail, Wind and Wuthering. And at the time, both Genesis and Peter Gabriel were managed by the same company, Tony Smith's Hit and Run. Genesis, for their Wind and Wuthering tour, were primed to pursue larger venues at last. Genesis had, in retrospect, made a masterful decision when planning to go out for their 1976 tour in support of A Trick of the Tail by enlisting the services of Bill Bruford as their touring drummer. Bill Bruford was very well known to American audiences for his work with Yes, and to a somewhat lesser extent, at that time, for his work in King Crimson, which had recently split. Bill Bruford's coming on board with Genesis, although it was only for one tour, got the attention of American audiences, and Genesis's 1976 tour was very successful, to the point where in early 1977, when they toured Wind and Wuthering, Genesis were able to play very large venues like Madison Square Garden in New York for the first time. Tony Smith was well aware of this, and he was aware of what it could do for Peter Gabriel's career. And he pulled some strings with Charisma and with Atlantic, who Peter Gabriel was still associated with in 1977, to delay the release of Peter Gabriel's first album until right around the time of the beginning of Genesis's tour. Genesis would play Madison Square Garden on February of 1977, right around the time that Peter Gabriel's album was issued by Atlantic in the United States. And Tony Smith worked Peter Gabriel's performance schedule, where although he wasn't playing the very large venues at this point, was playing some very respectable venues in and around the New York area, as well as nearby in Philadelphia, during the course of the month of March of '77. Smith timed this perfectly, in that Peter Gabriel appeared in New York and in Philadelphia no less than 6 times in March of '77. In today's marketplace, I doubt a promoter would be able to pull that off. Being part of a band myself, I know how difficult it is to arrange for multiple appearances of a band in a given geography within a short time frame. Contracts with venues usually include what are referred to as radius clauses, which provide some exclusivity to a venue in terms of when you can next perform in that area based on the fact that you've signed on with them. These clauses are usually written to restrict you from playing any closer than 60 miles away for a period of either 30 days before or 30 days after the show that you've signed on with them to do. So Hit and Run arranging for Peter Gabriel to play this frequently in New York right after Genesis played Madison Square Garden was a masterstroke on Tony Smith's part. And it worked. Genesis's performance with Wind and Wuthering was their best yet in the United States, reaching number 26 in the Billboard charts. Peter Gabriel's first album reached number 38, which was quite respectable. In fact, that was higher than The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, the last Peter Gabriel Genesis album, had reached. Again, that reached number 41, as I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, though, Peter's first album didn't stay on the Billboard charts for a prolonged period of time. It was clear that he would have to follow it up quickly. And he did in the early part of 1978, releasing his second album. The second album was, at least from a marketing perspective, probably something of a disappointment to Atlantic Records in the States. The two songs from it that were most suitable for radio airplay were, in fact, two songs that he had debuted during the 1977 tour, On the Air and DIY. A good portion of the album was also rather experimental. Peter had enlisted Robert Fripp as his record producer, and Fripp took this project as one of a trilogy of 3 projects that he was pursuing, the other 2 being Daryl Hall's album Sacred Songs, which had a delayed release and didn't come out for a couple of years afterwards, and Fripp's own first solo album, Exposure, which Peter Gabriel appeared on, as well as Fripp appearing playing guitar on various selections on Gabriel's second album. The second album didn't do poorly. It reached number 45 on the charts, but as I said, it, I suspect, made people at Atlantic Records wonder about where Peter's career would be going. And so when it came time for Peter to make his third album, the executives at Atlantic were very keen to get an understanding of whether this was a project that they felt they could successfully market to the American public. By late 1979, Peter Gabriel had his third album ready. The third album was produced by Steve Lillywhite, with Hugh Padgham working as recording engineer. And it was, in some regards, a very personal and somewhat experimental album. Peter was making use of numerous devices that weren't typical to rock and roll. Most notably, he was making use of Afrocentric rhythms. He had deliberately, during the course of recording, asked the 2 drummers who worked with him on the album, Phil Collins and Jerry Marotta, to not use cymbals, which gave the record something of a very stark sound. In order to deal with Gabriel's no cymbals restriction, Phil Collins, Jerry Marotta, and Hugh Padgham worked together to find alternative devices that they could use to spice up the drum approach on the album, with Collins and Padgham in particular coming up with what would come to be known as the gated reverb approach. This is the classic drum sound that Collins and Padgham used to great effect, not only on this album, but on Phil Collins's solo albums and on the Genesis records and other projects that Phil Collins worked on over the course of the early and middle 1980s. The record was demonstrated to Atlantic Records, specifically to one of their heads of artists and repertoire at the time, John Kolodner. John Kolodner hated the record. He didn't think it had any commercial potential, and he ultimately went to Atlantic's chief, Ahmet Ertegun, and suggested that Atlantic drop Peter Gabriel from their artist roster, which they did. Peter Gabriel obviously was not happy with this turn of events. He did, however, have a plan B available to him. By late 1979, Charisma Records had changed distribution yet again in the United States. They were being distributed by the Phonogram Company, which marketed their records in the United States through the Mercury Records label. Mercury Phonogram wasn't a favorite destination for artists to land on. They were well known in the 1970s as not spending a significant amount of money on artist promotion. You might recall the infamous song by Graham Parker and the Rumor from 1979, Mercury Poisoning, discussing Parker's irritation with Mercury Records and how he felt the record label curtailed his career development. But being affiliated with Mercury gave Charisma Records a place to quickly get Peter Gabriel's album out, and they did in early 1980. If anything, the rejection of the album by Atlantic seemed to light a fire under Peter Gabriel to make sure that the album would be as successful as possible. He believed in his work, and he wanted to make sure that he got it in front of the American public in a way that he could not be ignored, and to where he could politely but emphatically prove Atlantic Records and John Kalodner wrong. They toured vigorously to support the album, and also made a music video, something of a novelty in this early stage pre-MTV in 1980, to support the first single from the album, Games Without Frontiers, a song which was notable for including the vocal talents of the emerging star Kate Bush, one of the first recordings where she became known to American audiences. By the time Peter's tour got to New York in July of 1980, the band were very well rehearsed, and they put on a terrific show from beginning to end, but one that was not without surprises and not without some interesting side turns on the part of the band and how they presented their material. The show began with the band playing in rapid succession songs from the early portion of side one of Peter's third album, and Peter then switching over to go back to one of his signature songs, Salisbury Hill. Interestingly, when delivering the second verse of Salisbury Hill, Peter flubbed the words. He recovered, the band kept playing, but it was clear that he had made a mistake, and you could see his own irritation with himself at the fact that he had. Ultimately, Peter would get to the end of the third chorus of the song and end the song emphatically with the phrase, "I've learned the words, I've come to take you home." It got a laugh from the audience, to be sure, and Peter had broken the ice a bit. Following that, interestingly from a timing perspective, a fan called out from the back of the amphitheater for a Genesis song. "Get him out by Friday!" This caused Peter to laugh, and his rejoinder was a perfect one. "Ah, there's a man who knows ancient history." And he continued with the program. Peter's program was an interesting one, very focused on the third album, with 8 of the album's 10 songs being featured within the set he delivered that night. Interestingly, one of the 2 songs he did not play from the album was the single, Games Without Frontiers. Later in the show, Peter would get to another song from his first album, Moribund the Burgermeister. This song also featured something of a flub, in that the band started the song as you'd expect, and then Peter coming in with the vocals, but singing the lyrics for the second verse of the song, not the first. Peter caught this, and about halfway through the verse, flags the band down to stop, and explains to the audience, "You paid good money for this show. I'm not going to subject you to yet another problem like this. We're going to start this one over again." The audience applauded. Peter smiled, and they went on their way, delivering a great performance of the song. The show concluded with Peter's tour de force from the third album, Biko, with the song ultimately getting to its end and fading out, with one member of the band leaving the stage at a time until all you heard was a guitar drone. Peter would conclude the show with 3 encores. The first encore was On the Air from the second album, which was then followed up with its companion song from the second album, DIY. The final encore was done by Peter alone at the keyboard, doing a version of Here Comes the Flood, very similar to the one that would ultimately be included on Robert Fripp's Exposure album. And at that point, the night was done. I left the show thinking, first and foremost, that it was a great show and that I was happy to at last see Peter Gabriel perform live. But I was also very pleasantly surprised at how unflappable he was on stage and how he was able to embrace even the very obvious mistakes and turn them into triumphant moments where he and his audience could all have a laugh together. It showed a very mature and very confident artist, and it made me think that regardless of what Atlantic thought of his album, that the album would be, at the end of the day, a very successful one. And it was quite successful, reaching number 22 on the American Billboard charts. By comparison, in 1980, the Genesis album that was on the charts at that time, Duke, reached a peak of number 11, which was a bit higher than Gabriel's album, but still Genesis and Peter Gabriel were operating at comparable levels on the charts, and it became clear that neither band could be ignored in terms of their capabilities and what kind of performance they would be able to give to the American public from both an artistic and a commercial perspective. It's a show I enjoyed immensely, and it's one that I'll never forget. Thank you all for listening. As always, please hit like on the video. Please consider subscribing. And please feel free to leave comments. In particular, if you attended the show on July 7th, 1980, or if you saw any of Peter's concerts during 1980 in support of the third album, I'd be very curious to hear your impressions and observations as well. It'll make for good conversation as always. We look to have you back here again soon. You take very good care. Bye-bye.